Hello and welcome to Brexit and the food and beverage industry. My name is Connie and I'll be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. If you experience technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-779-3239. Please note that as an attendee, you are part of a larger audience. However, due to privacy rights, we have chosen not to display the number or list of attendees to everyone on the call today. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode throughout the duration of today's call, and as a reminder, today's call is being recorded. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. You may ask an online question anytime throughout the presentation by clicking in the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Please keep the send to default as all panelists. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's webinar. I would now like to introduce your first presenter for today, Jenny Arthur, Head of Membership. Jenny, you now have the floor.
As a valued member of Leatherhead, I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series of member webinars that will be running throughout 2020. I'm Jenny Arthur and I'm joined by Oliver Leedam, a consultant from our Regulatory Affairs team. This webinar is part of your membership package, and details of further webinars will be available on our website and in our monthly digest. If you have any questions about your membership, please contact the membership team on membership@leatherheadfoods.com. We will repeat this email address at the end of the webinar. The slides and audio recording of this webinar will be sent to you and will also be available in the members section of the Leatherhead website. To access the members section, you just need to type in your email address. So you can sit back, relax, and listen. But also, please submit your questions using the chat box anytime throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many of them as we can at the end, depending on the time available. We will also be publishing a Brexit white paper, which will be available again in the members section of the Leatherhead website. There are a large number of you here today, and we're looking forward to sharing our views on Brexit with you. As you can appreciate, it's a very fluid situation which is evolving daily. We will walk through our rationale set in the context of the broader landscape and then look in more detail at the nitty-gritty of what this means for the UK, EU and US supply chain. We would encourage you to use your helpline for any specific questions about individual product categories, as it is essential to understand the challenges and opportunities which will differ by product category and by business. And be sure to read our newsletters and email updates as you receive them. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Oliver, who will expertly guide us through this webinar. Over to you, Oliver.
Good afternoon or morning, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are. My name's Oliver Leedam. I've been working at Leatherhead for about 13 years now. Anyway, this is the format that we're going to be following for today's presentation, very quickly summarising the progress of Brexit to date before diving into more detail to outline what we believe will be a likely outcome of negotiations. And we look forward to what we believe you should look out for and who it may affect. So, the journey so far. It was slightly difficult picking a starting point. We could have gone back ages earlier than this, but David Cameron picking the referendum date of the 23rd of June 2016 seemed to be an appropriate start point. Of course, he was expecting or hoping for a Remain vote, and when it came out 52% in favour of leaving and 48% in favour of remaining, he resigned the next day. Theresa May became Prime Minister and spent a length of time trying to achieve a deal, didn't make it, and the job was, I say, handed over to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson became the leader of the Conservative Party, and on Theresa May's resignation became the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson's the current Prime Minister. He held an election on the 12th of December, gaining an 80-seat majority, so was able to carry through the agreement that was reached back in October of last year, and end of January the agreement was ratified and came into force. So what happens next? Well, I think the glass globe there is particularly apt. No one really knows. We shall try and do our best to peer through that globe and point you in the right direction. As we will see, the UK is actively seeking trade deals with a number of countries, as well as the EU. Both the EU and the UK recognise each other as key trading partners and want to secure a deal. However, they are starting from radically different positions, so there's still lots of ground to cover before we can understand what those deals may look like. Sajid Javid, back when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and was out in Davos, made the statement that trade deals in the short time available need to be prioritised on the market share. This, of course, will mean prioritising the EU over all others, and following on from the EU will be the US. To date, there is no deal secured with either the EU or the US. A number of trade deals have been achieved so far, listed down the side in the order of magnitude. The trade equates to £210 billion in total, or in fact just over 210 billion, which is equivalent to 16% of the UK's total import and export trade. My particular favourite there is the Faroe Islands, importing woolly jumpers and fish. So there we will see. The EU trade deal will need to be prioritised. When we look at here, we see that the EU composes over half of UK imports and just about half of the UK exports when compared to the rest of the world. And so the imports from the EU equal more than the imports from all other countries combined. What makes this particularly complex is that the trade from the UK has been totally integrated into the EU supply chain, and about 60% of UK exports are intermediate capital goods or raw materials, not final consumer goods. It's not uncommon to parts of the same product cross borders several times before finally being assembled. Consequently, any increased border friction will likely have serious implications both on the EU and the UK. That will cause issues for many sectors, but especially for short shelf life products and ingredients. The British Retail Consortium has flagged that consumers in the UK can expect higher costs and fewer goods due to trade frictions at borders. And Elizabeth de Jong, Policy Director of the Freight Transport Association, commented, "We're naturally disappointed that the promise of frictionless trade has been replaced with a promise that trade will be as seamless as possible, but not until 2025. This is when technology for so-called smart borders will be ready." The current negotiating stance was highlighted in our recent Brexit update. Hopefully you've had a chance to read that. Europe has been keen to emphasise that the UK can't expect a similar or better trade deal now it has left the single market, despite there being other third-party markets like Canada and Japan that do enjoy preferential trade deals. It's been expressed that the UK isn't Canada or Japan. David Frost, Britain's chief negotiator, set out that Britain was prepared to suffer increased barriers to trade, including tariffs, to realise a good deal for the UK. He also expressed a desire for regulatory autonomy, enabling new ideas and conditions to be realised quicker than in the EU at present, possibly hinting at a potential lean towards the generally recognised as safe philosophy of the United States. The EU's position is that unlike Canada, Japan and other such markets that had preferential trade deals founded largely on the World Trade Organization terms, the proximity of the UK and the volume of the trade it does with the EU makes this an unrealistic expectation. In creating such a trading relationship, they fear increased competition that would damage the prospect of the EU single market. A recent proposed change to the UK immigration policy has also threatened to limit the supply of low-skilled labour from the EU, which will be of a concern to many UK food and drink businesses. So, how is the negotiation going to progress? 17th of October, the political agreement was reached. And if a deal can't be reached by the 31st of December next year, the UK will default to WTO terms. The EU has published its directives for the negotiations of a new partnership with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, setting out the general principles that they want to follow. The UK has also set out its negotiating objectives today. Too late, unfortunately, to include in this webinar. It's about 48 pages and quite complex, so I'm going to have a dive through that once I have finished with this. The parties are going to start negotiating it in March. The UK must confirm in July whether it requires an extension to the end of year deadline. There's been press releases today saying that if the UK government doesn't notice any appreciable progress by June, they're going to withdraw from the negotiations. Whether that's politicians being politicians or what, I don't know. We have to wait and see. Wouldn't be surprised if an extension was requested, and of course won't be called an extension, or an intermediate trade deal proposed. So if we don't reach an agreement, we fall back to the World Trade Organization rules. The UK has submitted a draft schedule of national tariffs, and there have been 20 objections to these tariffs, including the US and China. So these would, as things stand, come into force on a non-certified basis. There is a precedent for this. The EU tariffs haven't been certified for a period because of objections when the EU expanded eastwards. The reason these objections at present can't be addressed is the World Trade Organization appellate body. This is effectively the World Trade Organization court that deals with disagreements has lost enough judges, 3 out of 7 judges, so it is in fact no longer functional. The US is currently blocking the appointment needed to bring it back into action. The WTO, as it mentions on the slide, doesn't only deal with tariffs, but in conjunction with the Codex Alimentarius, non-tariff barriers to trade. So what's the role of the US going to be? Boris Johnson made this statement in his first speech as Prime Minister, which I think points towards what he sees as the importance of the US. If you divide it into the 2 sections that it actually is, he is pointing towards the UK liberalising its GM rules and getting on with developing new GM crops. So the US is a key trading partner. If it's counted as against all the other countries, it is the single largest trading partner. Still doesn't match up with the rest of the world, but as it represents approximately 30% of the value of European trade with the UK, but the UK currently exports more to the US than it imports, so we're in surplus, and I think they're looking to rectify that situation. It is a more significant market as a service trading partner, but goods are always important. Food and beverages may actually not be at the top of the priority list. When you look at the top 5 imported goods into the UK, top of the list is cars, we go medical and pharmaceutical products, refined oil, and so on. And similarly, export goods, cars, mechanical power generation units, and so on. Food not being listed individually in any of those. The fact that the US runs a trade deficit with the UK is a concern for President Trump. He's seeking to address this. I think this comes under his America First standing. There's also the topic of web services and digital taxes, which have been an arguing point recently, as those businesses underpin a significant part of the US stock market. This has both pros and cons. As we know, the devil is in the detail, and hence seemingly insignificant compromises could create substantial challenges. We'll talk about some of these later. The US food and beverage agenda. The US administration has set out its intentions for negotiations, and these are paraphrased in the slide. These are 3 of the main things that crop up for the food and beverage businesses: eliminating tariffs, establishing regulatory compatibility, creating commitments for agricultural biotechnology. This would imply the removal of non-tariff barriers, sanitary and phytosanitary matters are second in the list of negotiating matters of the US Trade Representative. Restrictions on chlorine-treated chicken, or in fact, this is pathogen reduction treatments for meats, genetically modified crops, and hormone-treated meats. All of these are not only emotive topics within the UK, but in direct conflict with EU policy. For further context of significance, total US imports of agricultural products represented less than 3% of the total US exports to the UK. So, if we are going to diverge from the EU, what is it going to look like? We can say with relative confidence that any regulation will be very closely aligned with the EU, at least in the short term. If you look in legislation.gov.uk, the EU statute database, you'll find that all the EU regulations have already been imported and modifications made or noted that will be necessary for them to operate once the UK finally leaves the EU regulatory sphere of influence. Any divergence will be incentivised by the need to increase compatibility with the US, making sure that US imports into the UK are possible. Those of you who are familiar with the US and EU regulations will know that they're based on two very different principles. The precautionary principle and generally recognised as safe. The precautionary principle applied within the EU requires that one must prove beyond doubt that the product is safe before it can be placed on the market. The GRAS principle, however, simply requires that the product must generally be recognised as safe, e.g. it hasn't demonstrated harm previously. Whilst the sentiment of these two policies is to protect consumers, they do it in two different ways and are not overly compatible. It is argued that the US GRAS system favours commercial gain more than the precautionary principle. Here we go back to the ex-Chancellor Sajid Javid. He commented again at Davos that there will not be alignment, we will not be a rule taker, we will not be in the single market, and we will not be in the customs union. So we can be confident that the government is looking for some divergence to occur. As pointed out, there will not be alignment. This has been repeated since then by the Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab. So where are these areas of potential divergence, potential movement within the UK? When you contrast some of the key areas of US and EU misalignment and consider the US negotiating objectives, you rapidly come up with the following items. Novel ingredients. Consumers like it. CBD has gone ballistic. Consumers want it, but it's been classed as a novel ingredient and so is problematic. Any divergence will require increased manufacturing diligence and suitable proof of the ingredient isolation. Those of you who've been in the business as long as I have in the EU will remember the introduction of the allergen legislation and the isolation requirements there. We're looking at something probably very similar. EFSA and the Food Standards Agency recognise the need for speed, but are unlikely to compromise on the precautionary principle. GMO, consumer appetite needs qualification. Are they interested? Do they want it? Increased manufacturing diligence again will be required. Audible proof of isolation of ingredients also if we bring in non-EU approved ingredients. There's an interesting part here that the devolved authorities in the UK, Scotland and Wales, have already expressed a dislike for GM material and are saying that when they get the opportunity they will not accept it in their areas. Chlorinated chicken or the use of pathogen reduction treatments. It's a modest market opportunity, highly contentious within the UK and the EU. A lot of this is aligned with animal welfare standards. Protected designations of origin, the limit on where you can actually make a product. There are arguments from the US that they want to be able to make feta cheese and all sorts of things, so they want those rules removed. The interesting thing there is that it's not only the legislation, but the bodies who submit for the registration of their product are also very active in defending their products. So, on to painting the example of chlorinated chicken in slightly more detail. It's a relatively small part of the total trade for the US, and it is in conflict with a trend to change to improved animal welfare standards in the UK. The RSPCA assured statement really covers everything about the use of chlorinated chicken. For those of you who are not aware, that is the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. So obviously animal welfare is one of their main points. I think here things are unlikely to change, but it will be a matter of waiting to see. So divergence in detail. It's not only the divergence to allow the US goods into the UK, there's also the matter that various goods in the UK, or in particular bread and flour, have covered by the bread and flour regulations, which require flour produced in the UK to be fortified with calcium, iron, thiamine and nicotinic acid. Two of these are not to the standard or to the level required by the EU, and as the mutual recognition principle will have been lost when we become a third country, they will no longer be legal as is to be sold in the EU. Here it is a matter of waiting and seeing whether it's a matter of negotiation or changing the UK regulations or reformulating the products remains to be seen. Milk chocolate, it isn't a health matter, this isn't anything other than a quality issue. Milk chocolate in the UK requires not less than 20% total dry cocoa solids and not less than 20% dry milk solids, wherein the US Code of Federal Regulations at section 163.130, milk chocolate is allowed to have not less than 10% by weight of chocolate liquor, in effect cocoa solids, and not less than 12% by weight of total milk solids. So American milk chocolate doesn't count as British milk chocolate according to the standard regulations. This is quite amusing because I won't go into detail, but milk chocolate produced in the UK to these standards going into the EU can't be sold as milk chocolate and has to be sold as family milk chocolate. There is multiple divergence in products specified under legislation. Mainly goes down to the way that the legislation has evolved over time. The US legislation has been going far longer than the EU. The fruit preserves and jams in the US Code of Federal Regulations 150.160 has over 50 lines of legislation, while the jam and similar products England regulations of 2003 only has 32. So there are complexities there that need to be looked into. So, challenges and opportunities. These are high-level slides, but are really to indicate that any change will present both challenge and opportunity. On balance, we see the greatest opportunity for US suppliers looking to supply into the UK and EU suppliers who can potentially replace UK to EU suppliers, removing any potential border friction. The US are looking for the removal of non-tariff barriers to trade, freeing up access to the £23 billion market that is the food market in the UK. Whether it can form a potential gateway to selling goods on into the EU, I think is unlikely, but it may be something that is being looked for. The EU supply chain can look to replace, as I said, replace UK exporters due to cheaper costs and a easier supply chain without any border friction. And supply from the UK may therefore need re-evaluating. It's not all doom and gloom for UK businesses by any means, but we do expect a period of turbulence as businesses seek to shore up any supply chains and mitigate potential delays or price fluctuations. Much of this has yet to be defined and can only really be defined for your specific supply chain. What delays will be built in, what will happen, what routes you take. It all is very much individual to your manufacturing position. We'd recommend qualitatively assessing the potential impact now, if you haven't already, and look to review this as the deal becomes clearer. It's interesting at the moment with the publication of the UK free trade ideas for the deal with the EU. We now have all three available. The UK standpoint, the EU standpoint, and the US were far in advance, and we have their standpoint as well. So, conclusions and recommendations. EU trading relationship isn't going to be compromised, at least in the short term. We're adopting all their legislation. They've gone through and checked our meat production and all the systems in place at the moment, and we are approved for the supply of a lot of materials. It's going down to be down to customs and whatever, but the goods should be acceptable. A fully agreed trade agreement is unlikely to be achieved by December 2020. The UK has to decide if it needs an extension by July of this year. And they've said if they haven't got progress by June, they're pulling out of the talks anyway. So it's a matter there of waiting and seeing. It's too early to define any details of an interim trade agreement, but it's unlikely that either party will want to make significant changes from what's happening at the moment, apart from fisheries, of course. That's a big argument that is cropping up. We foresee a trade deal will be negotiated with the US, but timelines and specifics are unclear. It has to follow on from the EU being such a large market. It needs to be sorted out first. From a financial perspective, food and beverage is low on the priority list, but it's an emotive topic, and closer regulatory compatibility is expected, but not to the extent that it compromises UK-EU trade. The devil is in the detail: specific products, designations of origins, genetically modified organisms, or as in the US I think they call them, genetically engineered, novel foods. These all may be under negotiation, and this will impact each business differently. Recommendations. Look through your supply chain and understand the differences in regulations between the US, the EU. Every detail counts, and any other market that you care to be, that you're thinking of looking into. Monitor trade deals and qualifying new opportunities that may open up from other markets if regulations allow.
And don't forget, Gold, Platinum and Platinum Plus members, you can sign up to our Brexit newsletter, which comes out monthly, to get the latest developments and our take on them. So please email membership@leatherheadfood.com if you'd like to sign up. We're here to help if you need help with scenario planning, be it in a particular market or for your business. You can use your helpline for this, so don't forget. And finally, if you want another opinion, contact our regulatory team, who will be on hand to give our view and explain why. Well, that's the end of the webinar, and we're now going to move on to answering your questions submitted before and during the webinar. There have been a number. We'll not be able to get through all of them now, but we will respond to all the questions we haven't had a chance to answer after the event. Okay, Oliver, can we start with some questions? Okay. What kind of impact should we anticipate in terms of transportation delays because of customs clearance and health certificate issuing?
Right. A couple of weeks ago, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, to give him his full title, has said that it's not going to be possible to avoid customs checks on ferry routes across to Europe, and this would cause inevitable delay. One of the main points to note here is that the delay was going to last a number of years due to the implementation of the new government computerized system, and as mentioned earlier, is not envisioned as being fully operational until 2025. For an example, with the number of lorries passing through Dover per day, a delay of 1 minute per lorry would mean that it takes an extra 5 days to deal with that amount of traffic.
Okay, got another question here. Okay, will there be new requirements concerning exports from the EU to the UK of food and specifically organic products?
Right. At the same meeting, Michael Gove confirmed that all the UK exports and imports will be treated equally, and this will mean that traders in the EU and GB will have to submit customs declarations and be liable to goods checks. He confirmed that policy easements put in place for a potential no-deal exit are not being reintroduced, as they believe businesses have had time to prepare. If you're importing US produce from the EU, as long as your supplier is registered with an EU organic certification body for the production and shipment of organic goods, that should prove to be no problem.
Okay. We've had a number of questions in about country of origin requirements. So what can you tell me about country of origin requirements? Right.
This is a two-level question, and I'm just going to answer it at the very top level on labelling with a little mention on further. Country of origin or place of provenance is not mandatory on the label unless failure to do so is misleading. With England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland not being recognised as countries in their own right, labelling with made in England, Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland may be regarded as labelling with the place of provenance. This is not the same as country of origin labelling of the country of origin for tariff purposes. That tends to get very complicated very quickly on the value of the individual ingredients that go into the food or the product that you're producing, and the country with the most value input tends to be the country of origin, I believe.
Okay, another one here. Do you think it's likely that the UK will have a divergence from EU health claims legislation in the next few years?
The Department of Health has already gone through the nutrition and health claims regulations, and in their guidance they say, in fact, for producers, people submitting health claims, if you want a new health claim, there is going to be very little difference. All the standard EU and health and nutrition claims have been brought into the UK statute books. The difference is going to be after that, where if you want to make a health claim in the UK, it will have to be registered in the UK, and if you want to make a health claim in the EU, you'll have to register it in the EU. It wouldn't seem to make sense to go through all the work of gathering the required information to register a claim, which is the same at present, and not register it in both the UK and the EU. That is very much up to the producers to decide.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Oliver. I think that's all we've got time for this afternoon. Thank you for that very informative webinar, and thank you to everyone for listening. We will be emailing out the slides and the audio recording probably at the start of next week, and it will also be available on the member webinar. So I just want to say thank you once again for listening, and goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's webinar. You may now disconnect your lines.